Welcome back. At this point, we've discussed the, pardon me while I adjust. We've discussed the three persuasive artistic modes of persuasion: ethos, pathos, logos. I think I told the joke before, but someone added a fourth category, a fourth artistic mode, and that is the bogus argument, but that joke is old. It's up past its bedtime. Then we discussed the four divisions of rhetoric: political, forensic, ceremonial, and then the fourth category added in the Christian world, added by Christianity with the advent of Jesus Christ, and that is preaching. Now we're going to discuss the 5 canons of rhetoric. Now, 5 canons, no purpose in being trite or funny here. We're not talking about cannons sticking out of a ship or on a battlefield. The word canon is the same word used of the canon of Scripture. You have 66 books of the Bible, and that composes the canon of Scripture. The 5 canons of rhetoric, we're using the word canon in the same sense. A canon is a rule or law, or even a formula that composes a thing. It comes from the Greek, really a Hebrew and Greek word that denotes a reed or a cane. The reed or cane used as a standard, as a measure for a thing. It means something straight or something to keep straight. And so it's also used for the word rule, or something that is ruled or measured. So the 5 canons of rhetoric are speaking of the accepted principles or rules. It is the standards of judgment. Really, these 5 canons are the standards of rhetoric. It also is speaking of a body of principles or rules or standards or norms. That's essentially how a dictionary refers to it. In this case, the 5 canons refer to the 5 essential elements of rhetoric. They're the 5 activities that a rhetor performs in composing a piece of discourse, a speech, or an essay or a written composition. This is the life of the speech from beginning to end. That's what the 5 canons are. We start with the very beginning. In the process of developing a piece of discourse, we start at the beginning and go all the way to the end. So let me list those 5 canons for you, then I'll go back through and explain what they are. All right, the first canon of rhetoric is invention. The second is arrangement. The third, style. The fourth, memory. The fifth, delivery. Hopefully you can see the steps in the process of composing a piece of discourse. Invention has to be the starting point. The question was asked earlier in this course: what's the difference between modern day speech and composition courses and rhetoric? And the main difference is the emphasis of rhetoric, which is not on delivery, but is on invention. In order to say something, you must have something to say. That's the premise under which we study invention. I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. 75% of all that rhetoric texts have to say about rhetoric has to do with invention. Aristotle's definition of rhetoric, the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion, emphasizes invention, not the rest of rhetoric. Clearly, in Aristotle's mind, invention was the key component. Now, it makes sense, except for the fact that you can invent arguments all day long and never actually say anything, and you've not used rhetoric. But we have to recognize the necessity of invention as well to our rhetoric, because frankly, if we have nothing to say, then we have no business speaking or writing. If you're going to speak and write effectively, you must have something to say. Invention teaches you how to find what to say. Invention is the art of discovering available arguments. It is an art. Some people will naturally be better at discovering available arguments than others will be. But the result of a training course is that you will improve in your ability to discover available arguments so that when you speak, you will have something to say. Now, of course, there are a lot of things that go into that. Some students might approach this purely academically, and they might think that all I need to do is think about what my next speech is, my next composition, and just invent arguments that can be used for that. And so a student actually might get in a place where the only studying he ever does is for the moment, for the next speech, or the next essay, or the next composition. That would be a huge mistake. In Lesson 3 of the Rhetoric Companion, you find really early in the course a chapter on, or a lesson on copiousness. The ancient rhetoricians believed that copious was necessary for successful invention. Copiousness really is the ability to speak from a full mind, a full and ready mind, and that was their goal. That even though certainly study is necessary, in fact, for any rhetorical situation, you need to focus on and give attention to what you're going to say. You've got to be able to think it through and come to your own conclusions, not just regurgitate what other people have said. And that requires you to think and think hard. But the preparation for any opportunity to speak or write, the preparation is not just limited to the actual preparation for that rhetorical situation. There is an ongoing preparation. It's kind of the same thing. If a boxer only trains when he has a fight scheduled, so he's got a fight 2 months from now, and he starts training as soon as it's scheduled, he won't be in nearly the kind of condition he needs to be in for that fight. Training has to be ongoing, a constant thing. He trains year-round, non-stop. He doesn't take holidays. He doesn't take vacations. Every day, preparing his body for that fight. Then when he schedules the fight, his training regimen becomes intensified as he prepares for that fight. Similarly, if we take that metaphor a little bit farther, we have, if we look at rhetoric as kind of a fight with words, you have to recognize that there is a necessity for constant preparation. So that's really the indirect approach to invention, is just to think I am always preparing, always training. There's nothing wasted. Listen, I read all kinds of things, and partly because of the encouragement that I've received from studying these things, being well-read, reading widely, and so on, is invaluable to rhetoric, and particularly to invention. The ability to speak from your heart, from your mind, from a full and ready mind. All right? So copiousness is the ongoing preparation, but when you have a topic and you're asked to speak or to write on that topic, then it's necessary that you focus on that topic and discover the arguments that can be used in that argument. Now again, being well-read means that you will be able to draw from really water from a deep well. And that's what you want to be able to do. So copiousness has to be back of your study, but then you also have to think through the issue and think through it carefully. Now, there are some tools and some methods, approaches, and so on that we will be teaching here in this course that will help prepare you and enable you to discover the available arguments. That's what invention is, the speaker determining what he will say. Arrangement, also the Greek term for arrangement is dispositio. Arrangement involves the appropriate ordering of proofs within a discourse. So you've found your available arguments. You look at, let me back up here because we'll be using this a couple of different times in different ways. The ancients liked to take a kind of a general thesis type question that they could practice rhetoric, practice their use of rhetoric with. Okay, so a lot of the topics that they would choose from would start with should. Should one vote? Should one join the military? Should one marry? Should one join a church? And the list goes on and on. Should one eat meat? We can, any number of sample arguments that are useful for practice. So if we take should one marry, let's just take that one, and we might come up with a number of different arguments in favor of marrying, in favor of marriage. And I'm going to give a speech arguing that I should marry, or that someone should marry. And in fact, the question, should one marry, is a general question. It doesn't apply to a particular person. It would be a different question, for instance, if you asked, should a 16-year-old marry? And it would be a different question if you asked, should a divorced person marry? And it would be a different question if you asked, should Fred marry? Because then you would be considering a lot of specific details about Fred and so on. Just for the sake of practice, we take should one marry, and we list 10 arguments. We come up with 10 arguments why people in general should look for marriage, should look to marry. All right? Then arrangement takes those proofs which we've come up with, we've listed them out, 10 arguments, and arrangement teaches you to look at those arguments, pick out the strong ones, pick out the weak ones, and arrange them. And your arrangement also is persuasive. We'll talk at length about this, but you want to be careful which arguments you start with. Where do you put your strong arguments? Where do you put your weak arguments? You want to arrange them to give you the best chance of persuading your audience. You don't want to choose an argument that everyone will immediately be able to dismiss or refute, because as soon as they do, then they're done listening to you. That's an example of the kinds of things that we study under arrangement. The third canon of rhetoric is style. Also, the Greek term is elokutio. The appropriate composing and ornamenting of proofs within a discourse. So, when we present our proofs, we don't want to just set them out on the table. There they are in raw form. If you think of a dinner, your mom cooked dinners for you, countless dinners through your life. Is it a formal dinner? Is it an informal? The majority of meals cooked by your mother were just utilitarian. The mac and cheese is cooked in the pot, set on the table, a spoon, everyone has their bowl, they dip in, stick it in the bowl, and eat your mac and cheese. All right, but there are some occasions where you don't set the pot on the table, you put everything in a nice serving dish, and so on. You have to look at the occasion and ask, what does this occasion call for? That's where the ancients identified three basic styles: the grand style, the middle style, and the plain style. The grand style obviously is for more formal occasions, and you consider the occasion, you consider the topic, what you're going to speak about. You also have to consider yourself and whether it's appropriate for you to use such a grand style as that. Presidential inaugurations would be an example of a grand occasion that would call for more of a grand style. The middle style is the most frequently used style. It really fits. Sermons would typically be the middle style. The normal sermon, again, it'd be like your mom fixing dinner. She's cooking all the time. The pastor is constantly preaching. I preach I do Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, 4 times a week on a typical week. That amounts to somewhere in the vicinity of between 150 and 200 sermons a year. I have 4 or 5 times a year that someone comes and fills the pulpit for me. But I'm preaching that much. And then, of course, you throw in chapels and guest preaching opportunities and so on. It's probably 200 times a year. All right, so of those 200 times, there are not going to be many occasions that call for a grand style. But if the preacher is called to preach and it's a really formal occasion, a funeral perhaps, special meetings in a church, that may call for a more grand style. But typically, most speeches that you hear are middle style. Then the plain style is really conversational. What I'm doing right here would be between a plain and a middle style. It's probably closer to a middle style because I'm lecturing you and it feels more formal because I'm recording it. But if you were to come to my regular high school rhetoric class, it's a lot of discussion. I try not to talk for more than 10 minutes at a time without asking a question and getting some kind of response from my students. For my rhetoric class, the weekly discussion time for the college rhetoric class, the weekly discussion time that we do online would be an example of more of a plain style. It's conversational. If I could throw this out to you, just a sample statement, if I was going to describe the weather to you in a grand style. As temperatures plummeted into the single digits, the frigid air crackled with cold. I use bigger words, more elaborate description. It sounds out of place for normal conversation. All right, the middle style, the temperature dropped and it grew very cold outside. It's a straightforward kind of style, but it's not casual. I don't use slang and so on. The plain style would use slang. It's cold enough to freeze your nose hairs. That kind of thing probably isn't appropriate for more formal occasions, but it would be appropriate for conversation or for a setting that is more conversational. So that's style. Then the fourth canon of rhetoric is memory, and that's pretty obvious. But I'd point out to you that there are different levels of memory. In some of the lectures, recorded lectures that we've used here, I've relied heavily on notes, and you've probably noticed that. I'm looking down at my notes a lot, and I'm sticking to them. In this lecture in particular, I am speaking to you. I'm looking at the camera most of the time. I'm not looking at my notes very much. So there's a different level of memory. Now, in this case, that's because this particular lecture I have delivered frequently, where previous lectures I've had to tweak and improve and so on. And so it wasn't as firm in my own mind. This lecture is very familiar to me, and I'm able to do it from memory. There are, as I said, various levels of memory. There are various methods of memory, and so on. You know, like I said, I preach about, let's say, an average 175, 180 messages a year. I do not have the kind of mind that is capable of having all those sermons memorized. I just don't. I rely heavily on my sermon notes. I typically take 10 to 14 pages of notes to the pulpit with me, and I preach from those notes. But there are some occasions that are not as formal. Sunday school, for example, I'll preach for about the same amount of time, or teach for the same amount of time, but only 4 pages of notes. And I'm speaking a lot from my mind and so on. So that's an example. Of course, at one end with memory is just reading your notes straight up. And at the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the memorized speech, where it is memorized verbatim and polished and so on, the kind of speech that you do for a speech contest. Memory is simply the committing of memory, the committing to memory of a completed discourse or series of prompts. In order to speak, the speaker must know what he will say. The 5th canon of rhetoric is delivery. And if you're following the trail of a piece of discourse, it begins with invention, it ends with delivery. That's, if we take your mom as the cook again, she goes to the grocery store and buys all the ingredients for Thanksgiving dinner. Then she takes those ingredients and puts them together and cooks them. There's arrangement. She adds all the stuff to make it really special. That's style. And then there's I don't really have a part of, for memory, per se. Perhaps we could compare it to putting it in the dishes that how she's going to present that at the table. And then there's delivery, which is how she gets it from the stove to the table to your mouth. Where it's on your plate and you eat it. That's delivery. Delivery is the appropriate management of the voice, gestures, and appearance. The speech, the discourse, is not complete until the audience receives it, and that's delivery. Those are your 5 canons of discourse.